There's a quiet storm shaking the gospel world tonight. And it has nothing to do with music charts, choir battles, or Sunday sermons. It's a storm rooted in the unspoken, the whispered, the taboo conversations church leaders have avoided for years. The kind of topic no pastor wants to address publicly because it forces the entire community to confront something deeper than harmony, rhythm, or worship. It forces them to examine the cultural shift that took place right under their noses, a shift many now call the sassy, effeminate Marvin Sapp Winans effect, a transformation that didn't just influence gospel music, but reshaped the image of what a man of God should look like, sound like, and carry himself like. And today, that very aesthetic, celebrated by some and quietly questioned by others, is facing its biggest backlash yet, after a recent incident forced the entire gospel community to ask a question nobody had the courage to say out loud until now, a question that once you hear it, will forever change the way you look at gospel culture, because for years gospel fans adored the smooth voices, immaculate grooming, polished fashion, gentle tones, and charismatic presence of legendary figures like Marvin Sapp and the extended Winans family, whose influence has been undeniable, shaping choirs, shaping sound, shaping wardrobes, shaping stage presence, and shaping a new image of gospel excellence across multiple generations. But behind the breathtaking harmonies and pristine production was a conversation the church tiptoed around for more than a decade, a conversation about image, identity, masculinity, and the subtle yet powerful shift many say began when a certain aesthetic took hold. An aesthetic that fans called refined and classy, but church elders quietly described using an entirely different word. Today we peel back the layers that most people never dared to examine, exposing testimonies whispered among industry insiders, the murmurs of church mothers who said they saw something changing, and the growing number of young male gospel artists who privately admit they felt pressured to fit into a particular mold, a mold they didn't fully understand but were told was necessary to succeed, a mold that brought bookings, visibility, and mass appeal, but also created confusion, identity tension, and controversy. Because this story isn't just about style or personality, it's about the ripple effect that reshaped an entire culture, the questions it raised about authenticity and influence, the backlash it triggered in pews and pulpits across America, and the unexpected voices now stepping forward to challenge what they say has gone unchecked for far too long. And trust me, what you're about to hear next is where things go from surprising to unbelievable. But before we unveil the moment everything changed, we need to understand how the entire aesthetic took hold. Because the sassy, soft-spoken, ultra-groomed gospel look didn't appear out of thin air. Its origin goes back to the late 90s and early 2000s, when gospel music shifted dramatically from church basement choirs and raw wooden pulpits to polished televised productions that looked more like award shows than worship services. Suddenly, gospel artists weren't just singing, they were being branded, curated, styled, and marketed like mainstream celebrities. And in that era, image became just as important as vocal talent or anointing. This was the moment when the gospel world began looking closely at men like Marvin Sapp, B.B. Winans, C.C. Winans' extended musical circle, and the younger Winans generation, men who embodied a clean, sleek, camera-ready presence, sharp suits, perfect grooming, soft-spoken public appearances, refined gestures, delicate mannerisms, melodic speaking tones, gentle charisma, and an elegance that was noticeably different from the rugged, gritty, traditional masculine energy that had defined gospel men for decades. Gone were the days of oversized suits, thunderous baritone voices, and old-school preacher swagger, replaced by a polished, almost theatrical presentation. Smooth, calm, impeccably put together, and for many longtime churchgoers, confusing. Some loved it, calling it refreshing and modern, while others whispered concerns, saying something about this shift felt too soft, too pretty, too delicate, or too polished. But nothing was said publicly because these were beloved figures, icons of faith, and pillars of gospel excellence. Meanwhile, producers and industry executives loved the aesthetic. It was TV-friendly, mainstream-ready, marketable, universal in appeal, and created a gospel man who could easily transition between church stages, magazine covers, and televised award shows. Youth conferences booked these artists, award shows spotlighted them, and soon the aesthetic wasn't just appreciated, it became the blueprint. Young male gospel artists began adopting the same tone, posture, and meticulous grooming style, not because they were copying, but because it worked. It brought popularity, visibility, endorsements, and acceptance. Yet behind the scenes, this shift didn't come without controversy, because church elders began quietly wondering if the new wave was blurring lines they believed should remain firm. choir directors noticed teenage boys mimicking the mannerisms of their gospel heroes. Pastors discussed privately whether this influence would reshape the next generation's idea of masculine leadership in the church. And then came the question nobody wanted to say out loud: was this just harmless evolution, or was it something deeper? The debate didn't stay contained. It grew, spread, and transformed into a quiet cultural reckoning. And behind the polished stages and Instagram-perfect performances was a simmering tension that rippled through board meetings, after-service dinners, men's ministry discussions, and late-night phone calls between church leaders who didn't want their names attached to the conversation. And what happened next, the moment that pushed this issue from whispers to headlines, is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. A turn that exposed questions the gospel world can no longer avoid, and a cultural storm that is only beginning to unfold. People began noticing patterns they could no longer pretend weren't there. The soft-spoken interviews, the tightly tailored suits that hugged every frame, the graceful and almost choreographed gestures that seemed effortless yet strangely rehearsed, the subtle mannerisms that repeated from artist to artist as if they were part of some unspoken blueprint, and slowly, quietly, this polished tone became the visual identity of an entire generation of male gospel performers, sparking curiosity and concern in equal measure among churchgoers who loved the music but couldn't ignore the shift happening right before their eyes. And as always, the church mothers noticed first, sitting in the third row with their hats tilted, fans in hand, leaning forward with discerning eyes and whispering, "That boy can sing, but Shaw is different." And the word different held more weight than anything else they said, because it carried the unspoken truth they would never utter from a microphone. Meanwhile, fathers, deacons, and elders exchanged looks between verses, some shrugging it off as harmless, others feeling uneasy, and a few believing this quiet evolution represented a deeper shift in the spiritual atmosphere itself. But the conversation became complicated because millions genuinely loved the emotional vulnerability Marvin Sapp brought to the stage, the tear-filled testimonies, the trembling voice that cracked with sincerity, and they adored the Winans family for their elegance, their gentleness, their velvety harmonies, their smooth, refined presence that blended traditional gospel roots with contemporary sophistication. These traits weren't merely accepted, they were celebrated as signs of spiritual depth, so whenever anyone began to criticize the aesthetic, they were met with immediate resistance from supporters who insisted sensitivity was not weakness, gentleness was not effeminacy, and polished presentation had nothing to do with a man's identity or calling. But even with those defenses, the whispers never stopped. Behind closed doors, industry insiders quietly admitted that young male gospel artists felt pressure to adapt to this soft, camera-friendly persona because it was the only way to be platformed, promoted, or taken seriously. And one emerging singer revealed that a mentor told him straight up, they don't want ruggedness on stage anymore. They want charm. They want smooth. They want that Marvin and Winans touch. While another worship leader could confess that a producer told him to tone down his intensity and lean into a gentler persona because it photographed better, streamed better, and appealed to bigger markets. And this is where confusion intensified. Was the shift cultural? Was it marketing? Or was it quietly redefining how masculinity was allowed to exist inside the gospel industry? Then social media entered the conversation and amplified everything to a level nobody was prepared for. Clips went viral, mannerisms were dissected frame by frame, slowed down, zoomed in, turned into memes, and young imitators on TikTok exaggerated poses and gestures that mirrored their gospel idols until admiration blurred into caricature. With visibility came backlash, harsh commentary, bold accusations, and suddenly critics claimed the industry was glamorizing an effeminate persona that didn't reflect the traditional values the church taught, while others countered that this was simply a new wave, a release from outdated versions of masculinity, a shift toward emotional expression and freedom. The debate was no longer whispered, it was loud, polarizing, and impossible to contain. Pastors began addressing it indirectly in sermons, influencers dropped coded comments online, panel discussions danced around the topic without naming names, but the real turning point came with a moment nobody expected. A moment that pushed everything from quietly simmering tension to full-blown confrontation. For years, this debate simmered like a pot no one dared to open. But every cultural shift hits a breaking point, and this one arrived with thunder. It began with what should have been a simple live stream. Nothing polished, nothing staged, just a well-known pastor speaking transparently after a Sunday service, reading comments, and answering questions. And then someone in the chat wrote, not so subtly, that the younger generation of male gospel artists was looking a little too polished lately, and the pastor chuckled at first, brushing it off, but then his tone shifted in a way that sent a chill through anyone watching live. He said, "Some of these boys ain't just polished, they're being groomed into something that is not of God," and instantly the air around him froze. That sentence set off an earthquake across the internet that no one could stop, spreading within minutes as screenshots, reaction videos, angry reposts, emotional commentary, and endless debates erupted online. Suddenly, people weren't whispering about the sassy, effeminate Marvin Sapp Winans effect. They were shouting about it publicly, arguing about it in real time. With no filter and no mercy, some defended the pastor, saying he finally said what the church was afraid to say, while others accused him of attacking personalities, mocking mannerisms, and endangering people who had done nothing wrong. Inside the industry, panic spread. Executives worried about reputation fallout, artists feared being dragged into controversy, and public relations teams scrambled to prepare statements. Then, as if gasoline had been poured on the fire, old footage resurfaced. Performances, interviews, backstage clips, all being analyzed, judged, compared, and broken down like forensic evidence. People pointed out gestures, speech patterns, clothing choices, facial expressions, and suddenly names that had once been celebrated were dragged into online lists, charts, compilations, and comment section battles. Marvin Sapp's emotional performance style was revisited. The Winans' elegant, soft-spoken presence was put under a microscope, and younger artists who mirrored these traits were pulled directly into the spotlight, willingly or not. And thus the quiet cultural storm that had been building for years finally erupted into a nationwide confrontation that no one, not even gospel royalty, could escape. Some viewers continued insisting that gospel music had always carried a certain artistic flair, a natural expressive beauty woven into every run, every gesture, every polished note, and they argued passionately that sensitivity, elegance, and emotional vulnerability were not synonymous with anything inappropriate or questionable, calling the criticism old-fashioned, harsh, judgmental, even toxic. But at the same time, others saw something entirely different growing beneath the surface, believing the aesthetic shift wasn't accidental at all, but intentional, carefully crafted, and strategically pushed by image consultants, label executives, and marketing strategists who they claimed were deliberately shaping young male gospel artists into a template that blurred the masculine identity the church had upheld for generations. A shift orchestrated in boardrooms, reinforced during photo shoots, and celebrated in televised performances. This divide became even deeper when a former choir director shocked listeners during a podcast interview, claiming that several emerging gospel artists had been subtly encouraged, sometimes directly instructed, to soften their stage presence, lighten their vocal tone, adopt gentler body language, and lean into a more commercially friendly charisma designed to appeal to mainstream audiences. And though he never named names, the era he was referring to was unmistakable to everyone listening, sparking immediate uproar across social media as fans demanded answers, critics demanded explanations, and influencers labeled it the coded culture shift nobody recognized until it was too late. Suddenly, the Marvin Sapp Winans aesthetic wasn't just about style. It became a symbol, a lightning rod, a cultural battleground where masculinity, spirituality, identity, marketing, authenticity, and tradition collided publicly for the very first time. And right in the middle of the storm stood an entire generation of artists who had unknowingly inherited a legacy they never asked for but were now forced to defend, reinterpret, or reject. But the true shock came next, because just when people believed the conversation had reached maximum volume, something happened behind closed doors that shook the gospel industry to its core. Leaders met, discussions ignited, voices rose, and decisions were made quietly, discreetly, urgently, revealing a level of intensity no one outside the inner circle had anticipated. And when the truth of those meetings leaked, the disbelief was massive. At first, fans assumed the controversy would fade within a week, like every other online uproar, but instead it spread upward, beyond comments and hashtags, beyond church members and choir mothers, all the way to the upper floors of record labels, megachurch headquarters, conference organizers, and industry veterans who had built their entire reputation on stability and image control. Suddenly, a topic that had been avoided for decades was threatening the very structure of the modern gospel empire. And that's when things turned dramatic. Within days of the viral livestream and resurfacing footage, key leaders held emergency meetings, late-night phone calls, off-camera Zoom rooms, whispered conversations in back offices before Sunday service, all echoing one urgent message. This controversy is getting dangerous. We need to get ahead of it. And what happened during those private discussions left the gospel world stunned. Once the details leaked, insiders claimed a well-known bishop opened the meeting with a piercing statement: "We've created a culture we can't control anymore," referring not to music, but to the polished, gentle, soft-spoken aesthetic that had become the signature of modern male gospel artists, arguing that it had grown too influential, too widespread, too easy for critics to weaponize. Another leader pushed back, defending the artist by saying, "People are confusing excellence with effeminacy. We can't let outsiders dictate how our artists express themselves." But instead of calming tensions, the defense sparked even more conflict. One record executive admitted openly that the shift had been partly strategic, explaining that labels wanted a wider audience, more crossover appeal, a look that seemed sophisticated and approachable. Ruggedness didn't sell as well, smoothness did. And artists who naturally carried that gentle charisma rose effortlessly. He insisted it was marketing, not identity, but several leaders disagreed fiercely, worried the church was losing something deeper, and sending mixed signals to young men about what it meant to be a worship leader, a spiritual example, a male figure of influence. The arguments grew tense. One pastor even walked out, saying, "You're not ready for honesty." So this conversation can't help anybody. But the most stunning moment came when a document was presented. A list of rising artists flagged by conference organizers, not for scandals or misconduct, but for their image, with notes like too soft-spoken, too polished, too much flair, and instructions such as, "Don't let him lead the main session, place him earlier, not prime time." And the room fell silent because the truth was suddenly undeniable. The controversy wasn't just external, and the tension wasn't just among fans or online critics. The conflict was happening at the highest leadership level, quietly, strategically, and without public acknowledgement. And then came the moment that changed everything: the leak. Someone inside that meeting, someone frustrated, someone tired, someone who felt the conversation was drifting in the wrong direction, secretly recorded part of the discussion and leaked the audio online. No faces, no names, but the voices were unmistakable. Leaders could be heard arguing about whether the Marvin Sapp Winans influence had shifted the spiritual tone of male worship, with one voice saying, "We have to guide these young men back to a stronger presence," and another replying, "We don't need to fix anything. This is evolution." When the clip hit the internet, it exploded. Outrage, validation, anger, confusion, and endless debates filled comment sections. Some demanded transparency, others insisted the church had finally been forced to face an issue it buried for years. And as the dust settled, the most unexpected twist emerged. The artists themselves began speaking up, some defending their expression, others revealing painful stories of being judged, shamed, or sidelined because they didn't fit the traditional masculine standard. And for the first time ever, the people most affected by this cultural war chose not to remain silent.